Hello everyone, and welcome. I'm excited to invite you on a long historical journey into the world of the Knights Templar. In this story, we will see how a small group of humble knights took on a daring mission after the First Crusade, and how they grew to influence kings, popes, and people across continents. Along the way, we'll follow their path through battlefields and banking halls, from protecting pilgrims on dangerous roads to revolutionizing medieval finance. Their tale includes heroic victories, fierce battles, and a dramatic betrayal. By the end, I hope you'll see how the legacy of the Knights Templar still fascinates us today. Now, let's set out on our adventure together. The world before the Templars. By the late 11th century, Europe was a patchwork of feudal kingdoms. Powerful kings, nobles, and knights owed service and loyalty to one another in a strict hierarchy. At the same time, the Catholic Church had become the most influential force on the continent, shaping daily life and politics under strong popes. Far to the east, Muslim civilizations from Baghdad to Cordoba were advancing science, mathematics, and trade, in many ways outpacing the West. All three religions considered Jerusalem a holy city. Christians saw it as the place of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. Muslims honored the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque there. Jews remembered it as the site of Solomon's Temple. Since the 7th century, Muslim rulers had generally allowed Christian pilgrims safe access to these sites. But by the late 11th century, new powers were rising. The Seljuk Turks had conquered much of Byzantine territory and now threatened Christian pilgrims. They attacked Byzantine lands and made the traditional routes to Jerusalem unsafe. In 1095, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I asked Pope Urban II for help against the Turks. Pope Urban seized the moment. At the Council of Clermont, he urged knights across Europe to take up the cross and reclaim Jerusalem. He promised a full pardon of sins for those who joined. Thousands of warriors answered his call. They carried banners marked with a cross, shouting, "Deus vult," God wills it, as their battle cry. What followed was the First Crusade, an unprecedented expedition from Western Europe to the Holy Land. Over the next 4 years, Crusader armies marched to the east. After sieges at Antioch and elsewhere, they finally reached Jerusalem in 1099. The city's walls were stormed in July. The victory was tragic and brutal. Chronicle accounts tell of Christian soldiers wading in the blood of the conquered city. Despite that horror, the Crusaders carved out new states. They established the Kingdom of Jerusalem and other Crusader principalities along the Levantine coast. Godfrey of Bouillon became the city's first ruler, taking the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre instead of king. After he died in 1100, his brother Baldwin the Fawn was crowned king. This amazing success created new challenges. After the Crusade, most knights and soldiers returned to Europe having fulfilled their vows, leaving the Christian lands short of people. What remained was a thin slice of territory. A few coastal cities and castles surrounded by hostile lands. The Christian population was tiny compared to the local Muslim population. The kingdom's survival depended on maintaining links with Europe for reinforcements, supplies, and new settlers. Without these links, the kingdom could not hold itself. Travel in the Holy Land quickly became extremely dangerous. The road from the port of Jaffa on the Mediterranean coast up to Jerusalem and other holy sites wound through rugged hills controlled by hostile forces and bandits. With few soldiers to patrol the countryside, travelers were easy targets. Christian pilgrims, carrying offerings of gold and silk for the shrines, faced robbery or worse. Tales of attacks on pilgrims spread back to Europe, frightening many. Journeys that had been acts of devotion turned into life-threatening adventures. By the 1110s, it was clear that something had to change. Pilgrims and caravans needed protection. It was in these desperate conditions that an extraordinary idea took shape. The birth of the Templar Order. In 1119, nearly 20 years after the First Crusade, a French knight named Hugues de Payens came forward with a bold proposal. He was accompanied by 8 fellow knights before King Baldwin II of Jerusalem and Patriarch Warmond. In a solemn ceremony, these 9 warriors took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They dedicated their lives to a new purpose, to protect Christian pilgrims on the dangerous roads in the Holy Land. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, a name soon shortened to the Knights Templar. Their name came from their first headquarters on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, next to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, built on what Christians believed were the ruins of King Solomon's ancient temple. King Baldwin granted the small order a wing of his own palace there. This prestigious location gave the Templars a powerful symbol and a base for organizing patrols. From then on, they drew inspiration from the biblical guardians of Solomon's temple as they guarded pilgrims of the new era. Hugues de Payens and his companions were not ordinary adventurers. They were seasoned fighters from noble families who had already fought in the Crusades. Among them were Godfrey de Saint-Omer and Payen de Montbard, men who represented the flower of European knighthood. All had trained in mounted combat and earned their spurs in battle. They came together out of deep religious devotion and a vision of service. Over time, more knights joined their ranks, inspired by this example. What set the Templars apart was their unique combination of monastic life and warfare. These men lived under strict vows and humble discipline, yet rode into battle armed to the teeth. Contemporary accounts tell us that their poverty was genuine. In the beginning, 2 Templars often shared one horse as a symbol of their simplicity. The brothers wore plain white cloaks marked only by a red cross on the left shoulder. This uniform look and their strict lifestyle set them apart from worldly knights, emphasizing that they fought for God's cause rather than personal glory. From the very start, the Templars put their mission into practice. They began organizing pilgrim caravans with armed escorts. Knights would post lookouts at the front and rear of each group. With spears, swords, and bowmen, they warded off bandits and raiders. Chroniclers credit these measures with an immediate drop in pilgrim casualties. Over nearly a decade, the Templars built a reputation for discipline and effectiveness. Word spread throughout Europe. Under their protection, the road to Jerusalem was far safer. Even as they proved themselves, many churchmen and laypeople found the Templar idea surprising. Traditional monks prized peace and prayer, while secular knights prized honor in battle. A knight in armor taking monastic vows seemed contradictory. Questions arose. How could a fighting man live a spiritual life? Should these warrior monks answer to a king or to the church alone? Such doubts lingered for years. But practical necessity prevailed. The Templars' value in defending Christian pilgrims and territories gradually won acceptance. More knights volunteered to join, and grateful pilgrims praised them in reports back home. The order had begun to establish itself. The Crusader states and Templar politics. The Crusader states, the new Christian kingdoms carved from the Middle East, existed in a world unlike any in Europe. Known collectively as Outremer, the land beyond the sea, they included the Kingdom of Jerusalem and smaller principalities like Antioch, Tripoli, and Edessa. Each had its own ruler and laws. Together they formed a narrow band of coastal Christian territory surrounded by powerful Muslim states. European kings had tried feudal systems here, but conditions were very different. In Jerusalem, for example, the crown was actually elective, though often kept in one dynasty, and women could inherit the throne, unusual for medieval Europe. Succession could become tangled when daughters or their husbands took power. The fragile Christian states had to adapt constantly to a hostile environment. The Templars stepped into this complex politics with both opportunity and caution. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem had already befriended Hugues de Payens and his knights. After all, they were fulfilling a vital need of the kingdom. In fact, Baldwin had given them quarters on the Temple Mount before they even had a formal rule. Because the Templars were doing work the king needed, protecting roads and pilgrims, they enjoyed royal favor. Initially, their task aligned perfectly with the king's interests, keeping Jerusalem connected and safe for Christians. As the Templars grew stronger, kings of Jerusalem found even more ways to use them. By the mid-12th century, the order had begun building castles along dangerous frontiers, fortresses like Château Pèlerin and Safed. These castles extended the kingdom's reach into the hills and guarded key mountain passes. The Templars thus evolved from auxiliary escorts into core military infrastructure. Kings increasingly relied on their fortress network to project authority in areas where direct royal control was weak. In this way, the Templars' rise directly supported the kingdom's defense. The political position of the Templars became especially complex under King Fulk, ruling 1131–1143. Fulk, formerly Count of Anjou, married Queen Melisande of Jerusalem and needed strong allies. The Templars' international connections and papal backing made them invaluable to him as a counterbalance against feuding nobles. Still, tensions were inevitable. The Templars paid no taxes and answered only to the Pope, creating a semi-independent power center inside the kingdom. When king and Templar goals aligned, this arrangement worked well, united against common enemies. But when interests diverged, it could cause dangerous friction and weaken unified action. Outside Jerusalem, the Templars forged ties in other Crusader states. In Tripoli, Count Raymond II granted them extensive land, including strategic mountain passes into Syria. The order thus had a strong presence there. In Antioch, they also held lands, though their involvement was more cautious because Antioch was closely entangled with Byzantine politics. In far-off Edessa, their presence was light. Edessa itself fell to Turkish forces early on, leaving little for the Templars to do there. Diplomatically, the Crusader states and the Knights Templar were pragmatic. Contrary to the idea of non-stop religious war, the period saw frequent truces and treaties with neighboring Muslim leaders. Trade had to go on. For example, Italian merchants continued to sail under agreements with local powers. In negotiations, the Templars often proved useful mediators because they were expected to honor agreements strictly. Their reputation for integrity made them trusted. In fact, their control of key forts and safe roads meant Muslim rulers also sometimes sought truces with Christian states to avoid constant conflict. Within the Christian camp, factional struggles often distracted from defense. Rival noble families and factions quarreled for power, shifting alliances frequently. Newly arrived European Crusaders sometimes clashed with the native Crusaders, the children of earlier settlers, who had different attitudes about coexisting with Muslims. The Templars generally aligned with the hardline element that favored military action over compromise. This made sense because their job was to fight raiders after all, but it also put them at odds with those who wished to negotiate or buy peace. The military orders themselves could be rivals. The Knights Hospitaller, originally a hospital charity, had by now formed their own army, partly in response to the Templars' success. The two orders, though both defending Christian lands, often competed for donations and influence. Chroniclers note that at times tensions grew so high that kings had to step in to keep them cooperating. In one tragic case, the War of St. Sabas 1256, Genoese-backed Templars and Venetian-backed Hospitallers actually fought in the streets of Acre, weakening the city against enemy threats. Despite all this political complexity, the Templars retained a single guiding mission: protect Christendom in the Holy Land. Even after Jerusalem fell in 1187, the order's castles became the primary Christian strongholds. With secular nobility decimated, the military order's independent financing and recruitment made them arguably the most reliable defenders remaining. Throughout these years, the Templars had to balance their spiritual ideals, poverty, obedience, service to God, with the pragmatic need to negotiate, fight alongside allies, and sometimes act as diplomats or land managers. Different Grand Masters handled this tension in different ways. Some sought to stay out of political entanglements, while others became deeply involved in state affairs. This constant juggling between the convent and the council chamber was a defining aspect of the Templar experience. The Templar Code and Organization. In 1129, the Templar Order received formal approval at the Council of Troyes. There, under the influence of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the era's most respected religious leader, their rule was written down. Bernard even wrote in praise of the new warrior monks, contrasting them to worldly knights who fought for fame or fortune. The new Templar rule became a remarkable document blending monkish discipline with military necessity. It laid out strict regulations for prayer, warfare, and daily life alike. At the top of the order's structure stood the Grand Master, elected for life by the senior knights. He held both spiritual and military command. Each year he presided over a central meeting called the Chapter, where important decisions were made with input from all major commanders. Beneath the Grand Master were various officers: the Seneschal, deputy leader and chief administrator; the Marshal oversaw military training and equipment; the Draper, in charge of clothing and gear; and the Treasurer managed finances. Each geographical district or commandery had its own master who reported up the chain. This complicated hierarchy allowed the Templars to manage estates from Portugal to Cyprus, even though messages could take months to travel by horseback. The rule also defined different classes of members. Knight brothers, all of noble birth, made up the elite cavalry. Sergeant brothers, non-nobles, served as infantry and took care of many logistical tasks. Chaplain brothers, who were priests, handled religious services and the souls of the order. Serving brothers performed essential work behind the scenes, from cooking and blacksmithing to maintaining the stables and inns. This structure mirrored medieval society while ensuring everyone had a role. Above all, it meant that in combat, a knight only fought. He did not have to cook his own food or mend his own armor. Daily life for a Templar was highly regimented. From dawn till dusk, every moment had its purpose. Brothers rose before sunrise for matins, the first prayer service of the day. After early Mass, they broke their overnight fast with a simple meal. The morning was then devoted to military training. Knights practiced riding in formation, swung swords and axes, and polished their weapons. By midday came terce, the mid-morning prayer, and the main meal of the day. Lunch was taken in silence in the communal refectory, with a chaplain reading scripture aloud. Unlike other military camps of the time, conversation during meals was forbidden to maintain a monastic atmosphere. The rule allowed meat only 3 days a week, more than in most monasteries to meet a knight's needs, but portions remained modest. Afternoons varied. Some brothers would march out on patrol to scout or escort pilgrims. Others might supervise the harvest, teach new recruits, or manage stores and correspondence. No brother was stuck at one job forever. They rotated through duties so that every man experienced castle guard, farm work, and office work during his career. As evening approached, the knights gathered again for vespers. After Compline, night prayer, they retired to dormitories. They slept on simple rope beds or thin mats. Each man had only what the order issued him. Personal belongings were nearly non-existent. A few sets of clothing, a horse, a sword, and a prayer book constituted a lifetime's possessions. Throughout all this, silence and obedience were paramount. The rule encouraged knights to maintain an inner prayer even while doing tasks. For example, while a sergeant polished the Templar cross on a sheath or a knight cleaned his sword, he was taught to reflect on a verse or offer quiet prayer. Every activity, even hygiene, had regulations. Templars cut their hair short under helmets and kept neatly trimmed beards, never going clean-shaven like fashion of secular knights. A white mantle with a red cross identified full knights. Sergeants and servants wore brown or black robes with the cross. These rules marked them visually as set apart. The 3 core vows shaped everything. Poverty meant no knight-owned money, land, or possessions. All were the orders. Even gifts required approval. Despite this, the order itself could own vast wealth to fund its work. Chastity forbade sexual relations or even unchaste behavior. Templars avoided private contact with women altogether. Obedience was critical, especially in battle. There was no room for individual initiative on the battlefield. Each brother had to follow orders immediately. This discipline made the Templar formations especially effective. Minor infractions, like talking out of turn, might earn extra prayers or bread instead of meat at the next meal. More serious offenses, falling asleep on watch for instance, could mean public flogging or isolation until penance was done. Such strict discipline turned the Knights into one well-oiled machine, fully committed to their mission. The rise of the Templars. After their rule was formalized, the Knights Templar began an astonishing rise in power and influence. All across Europe, noble families vied to demonstrate their piety by donating generously to the order. Landowners from Scotland to Spain and Hungary bestowed castles, farms, mills, and churches to the Templars. Even common knights and merchants gave smaller donations in hopes of spiritual merit. Each gift, large or small, swelled the order's resources. Within a few decades, the Templars owned a vast network of estates. Fields and vineyards on these estates produced grain, wine, wool, and olive oil that brought steady income. Urban properties in cities like London, Paris, and Rome generated rents. For example, the famous Paris Temple became more than a fortress. It was a banking center. Kings, nobles, and wealthy citizens locked their treasure there for safety. King Louis VII of France held royal councils in the Paris Temple, and King John of England stored crown jewels in the London New Temple. Soon, these sites effectively functioned as national treasuries. By the early 1200s, France was virtually depositing state funds in the Paris Temple under Templar care. To manage this wealth, the order built a sophisticated administration. Each regional preceptor was responsible for the productivity of his commandery. A percentage of all revenue was sent east to support the Christian war effort in the Holy Land. The rest funded local needs. This financial pipeline meant Templar forces in the east had resources that other Crusaders lacked. Meanwhile, in Europe, each commandery maintained accounts and sent reports upward. The Grand Master's headquarters kept detailed records of assets, people, and revenues across continents, information unparalleled anywhere else in that era. Military power also fueled the Templars' rise. They strategically built and garrisoned castles in every vulnerable corner of the Crusader realms. Strongholds like Chateau Pèlerin, built on a promontory by Acre and safed on a mountain peak, commanded the landscape. Their architecture was cutting edge. Castles featured concentric walls for layered defense, arrow-slit loopholes, and bent entrances to slow enemy battering rams. They even pioneered murder holes, openings above gates where defenders poured boiling oil or rocks onto attackers. Desert forts had huge cisterns to capture rain, and mountain castles were carved into natural rock. These innovations showed the Templars' pragmatic skill at warfare. Their battlefield tactics were equally advanced. Templar knights trained rigorously and fought in disciplined formations. Unlike many feudal armies, a Templar unit never broke ranks for personal glory. If they charged, they did so together. They also learned from their enemies. While European knights often dismissed Muslim tactics, Templar leaders studied the swift cavalry and archers they fought. On the battlefield, the knights combined heavy shock attacks with lighter eastern maneuvers. They even maintained scouting units trained in local terrain. Over time, they also became experts at breeding war horses. In stud farms from Aquitaine to Damascus, the order crossed tough Arabian horses with sturdy European breeds. The result was animals strong enough to carry armored knights across deserts. European monarchs later sought the Templars' advice to improve their own horses. The Second Crusade, 1147 to 1150, was the first large war where the order's growing strength became visible. While the crusade itself mostly failed, the Templars showed their value. King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany were impressed by the knights' performance. In chronicles of that time, the Templars' disciplined vanguard and reliable logistics are praised, while blame for the failed campaign fell on the king's lack of coordination. The order emerged from this unharmed and even more respected. Throughout the later 12th century, the Templar reputation soared. Kings and nobles across Europe sought their friendship and support. Kings John and Henry III of England, among others, relied on the Templar administration for advice and safekeeping of valuables. Ordinary people looked on the white-clad knights with awe and gratitude. A Templar escort meant life insurance on a pilgrimage. In a few decades, the humble band that had started by protecting a few pilgrims had become an international superpower with tens of thousands of members and properties across 2 continents. This meteoric rise brought contradictions. An order founded on poverty had become fabulously wealthy. Exempt from church and royal taxes, the Templars answered only to the Pope, a fact that angered some monarchs. Their international scope sometimes clashed with growing European crowns wanting control at home. Yet during their heyday, the Knights Templar managed these issues. They used careful diplomacy and the sheer value of their services to avoid conflicts with secular rulers. Their strict discipline kept scandal at bay, and their ongoing defense of Christian lands justified their privileges in the eyes of most contemporaries. All told, the Templars had built a golden age that few medieval institutions could rival. Masters of the Sea, Templar naval power. Most people picture the Knights Templar as knights on horseback, but their military skill extended far beyond land. By the mid-12th century, the order had developed a substantial navy that would dramatically shift power in the eastern Mediterranean. The Christian states in the Levant depended entirely on sea connections to Europe for soldiers, food, and money. Muslim fleets and rampant piracy threatened these lifelines. The Templars responded by becoming masters of the sea as well as land. It began modestly. The brothers bought several sturdy merchant ships to carry horses, weapons, and supplies from Europe to the Holy Land. These first vessels served mainly transport needs, but the order soon realized that protected sea lanes required warships. They established their primary naval base at Acre, near the Mediterranean coast. There they built docks, shipyards, stone quays, and warehouses, a maritime complex that amazed visitors who said it rivaled the biggest ports in Europe. They also set up smaller bases at Tyre and Jaffa. From these coastal strongholds, Templar galleys patrolled relentlessly, turning countless hidden coves into safe harbors for their ships. The Templars maintained a mixed fleet, each ship type serving a purpose. Agile galleys with oars could chase pirates along the shore. Larger naves carried heavy war horses and equipment. They even designed special ships to carry hundreds of pilgrims at a time, with reinforced decks and compartments. Accounts suggest the order kept dozens of vessels at sea during its peak. Managing such a fleet meant new skills. The Templars created a dedicated Marine Corps. Knight captains with naval experience led the crews, and they hired expert sailors, often Italians from Genoa or Venice, as pilots and engineers. Together, these mariners learned navigation, ship handling, and naval warfare tactics. Templar ships filled many roles. Regular patrols along pilgrim sea routes greatly reduced piracy. They organized convoy systems, escorting merchant and pilgrim vessels together under a single Templar guard. This improved trade and travel security between East and West. The Navy also provided vital support during sieges. For instance, in the Third Crusade's Siege of Acre, 1189–1191, Templar galleys formed a naval blockade that kept Muslim reinforcements out. They ferried siege engines and guns to the besiegers and evacuated wounded knights to rear hospitals. Without this maritime aid, capturing Acre would have been far harder. When Crusader nobles or armies traveled to the Holy Land, they often booked passage on Templar ships. The order was known for its reliable schedules and safe travel, and was willing to charge premium fares. Even average pilgrims sometimes paid the fee for a secure voyage. The Templars set up regular sailing schedules between major Mediterranean ports, almost like an early passenger service. During peaceful times, their ships also plied trade routes. They carried silk, spices, and other Eastern goods to Europe, then loaded up with wool, wine, or grain for the return trip. The profits from these trading voyages helped finance the Order's mission, while tying the distant regions into one economy. Templar ships themselves were technological hybrids. They blended Western and Eastern design elements. The hulls were deep and sturdy like European vessels to carry heavy loads, but their sails and rigging borrowed tricks from Arab ships for better handling. Knights even adopted navigation practices from Muslim mariners, using stars, rudimentary charts, and new compasses. They developed nighttime signals, arranging lanterns in patterns so that fleets could stay in formation after dark. This signal system was actually more advanced than what most navies used in Europe at the time. These technical innovations gave the Templar fleet an edge even though it was smaller than the Muslim or Italian fleets. Control of the Mediterranean waters raised the Templars' political influence as well. In negotiations, they now had leverage. European rulers in the East, such as French, English, or Holy Roman authorities, were happy to use Templar ships to send envoys or goods, and diplomats trusted the Order's neutrality in conflicts. When European kingdoms quarreled in Outremer, only the Templars' ships provided a reliable sea route for communication or compromise. After the fall of Jerusalem and later Acre, the Templar navy remained a lifeline for the shrinking Crusader domain. Their ships maintained essential sea links to isolated cities that were otherwise cut off by land. Coastal fortresses held by the military orders survived largely because they could be resupplied by sea. During the Cataclysm of 1291, Templar and Hospitaller ships helped evacuate citizens and soldiers from falling cities. Even seafaring had to fit their religious rules. Life aboard ship presented unique challenges to the vow of discipline. The Order created special regulations for mariners, shipboard chaplains held adapted prayer services at sea, and brothers made allowances for long voyages, for example in meal schedules. By the decades following the Third Crusade, naval power became more important than ever to the remaining Christian outposts. The maritime legacy of the Templars outlived them long after they left the Levant. Portuguese historians note that after the Templar Order was disbanded in 1312, many ships, sailors, and navigational charts passed to the new Order of Christ. That order helped underwrite Portugal's voyages down the African coast and across the Atlantic in the 15th and 16th centuries. In this way, the Templars' centuries-old knowledge of Mediterranean navigation would indirectly fuel the age of exploration. By developing effective naval capabilities alongside their famous mounted knights, the Templars demonstrated an integrated approach to security ahead of its time. Spanning both land and sea, this complete strategy helped lay the foundation for their rise and ensures their memory endures in both the history of warfare and the history of the world's oceans. The Bankers of Christendom. By the 12th century, the Templars were becoming best known for something other than swords. They were bankers. The problem they solved was simple. Traveling with a purse of gold was perilous. Bandits and enemies along the road made every pilgrim carrying treasure a target. To remedy this, the Knight monks invented an elegant financial system. A pilgrim could deposit funds at a local Templar house before leaving home, receiving a sealed document of credit encoded with special symbols. Upon arriving in the Holy Land, the pilgrim would present this document at a Templar commandery and receive the equivalent funds in local currency, minus a small fee. In effect, this was an early form of letter of credit. It allowed pilgrims and later merchants to move money safely across vast distances without risking robbery. Traders eagerly embraced this innovation. Long-distance commerce had faced big challenges, changing currencies, thieves on trade routes, and the need for trust in far-off markets. The Templar banking network offered solutions. A merchant could deposit valuable coins in Paris and later withdraw the same value in Jerusalem or Acre. As trade expanded during the High Middle Ages, this system let commerce operate on a scale once unimaginable. European and Middle Eastern markets suddenly became linked by the Order's vaults and ledgers. Goods flowed and funds flew across the network without anyone having to physically carry every coin across hostile lands. European monarchs also recognized the Templars' banking talents. Most royal treasuries were still just strongboxes kept by whoever was traveling with the king, a setup rife with danger and disorder. Philip IV of France, Edward I of England, and others began using the Templars in the early 13th century. King Louis VII of France, returning from the Second Crusade, put royal funds in the Paris Temple and even hired a Templar knight as his treasurer. English kings did likewise with the London Temple. By the early 1200s, the Paris Temple was effectively the French national treasury. It stored taxes, loans, and even royal jewelry. This arrangement offered secure, literate management that no single nation yet had. The order backed its reputation with strict procedures. The Templars were meticulous bookkeepers. They kept clear records separating travelers' deposits from the order's funds, a medieval ancestor of what we now call a trust account. Annually, officials inspected local accounts, verifying that every transaction followed the rules. They even used early double-entry bookkeeping, a method that would only catch on in Europe centuries later. Thanks to this, their international network enjoyed a level of financial transparency unmatched at the time. If a preceptor in Spain lost track of some gold, the headquarters in Jerusalem or Paris would know exactly what should have been there. This unprecedented accountability made the Templars trusted stewards of money. Lending money was trickier because the church forbade outright interest. Still, the Templars found ways to provide credit. They arranged deals like mortgage-like sales of property and foreign exchange transactions that effectively acted as loans, all while skirting the usury rules. Kings found these services extremely useful. When King Louis IX of France prepared for the Seventh Crusade, 1248 and 1254, he borrowed huge sums from the order to finance the expedition. Henry III of England repeatedly turned to Templar credit in times of need. These loans tied the crowns closely to the Templars. Royal coffers depended on the order, and the order's leaders gained political clout as lenders to kings. Templar communities designed secure fortifications for their new financial role. Every major preceptory included vaulted treasury chambers. The Paris Temple's Great Tower was a masterpiece of security. Its stone walls were several meters thick, and multiple antechambers kept would-be thieves at bay. Other houses had hidden strong rooms and iron-bound chests. Such precautions impressed travelers and dignitaries. Contemporaries noted that no one dared tamper with a Templar vault. Under so many layers of defense and oversight, kings felt their wealth was safer with a Templar than under lock and key back home. Through these financial activities, the Knights Templar had become, in effect, the bankers of medieval Europe. They provided services to pilgrims, merchants, and monarchs alike, connecting the economies of Europe with the Holy Land. Remarkably, this global banking network was operated not by a state or a merchant consortium, but by an order of warrior monks. Their innovations in money handling and trust mechanisms laid foundations that outlasted them by centuries. The Templars' economic empire. While their banking drew headlines, the Knights Templar quietly managed a vast economic empire on land. Noble benefactors had granted them an astonishing amount of property. From cool English fields to sun-baked Spanish estates, Templar farms covered huge tracts of Europe. The order typically did not farm these lands directly. Instead, they used a tenant system. Local peasants agreed to pay rent in crops or money under formal leases. This gave the Templars a steady income, in grain, wool, or coin, without needing to farm every furrow themselves. This arrangement fit their ideals. The brothers themselves would maintain poverty while using the productivity of others. The Templars made those lands extremely productive. They applied advanced agricultural methods for the time. Many estates used crop rotation, alternating grains with legumes or fallow periods to keep the soil fertile. In dry regions, the order built irrigation canals. In wet northern lands, they dug drainage ditches. They carefully managed forests, harvesting timber for building ships and castles while ensuring young trees were planted. Altogether, these efforts made Templar estates unusually efficient. Chroniclers mention that even modest-looking holdings often produced more than expected. Animal husbandry was another strong suit. The Templars maintained large flocks of sheep, providing wool that entered the international trade network. They bred war horses to military specifications. They needed big, strong mounts that could also endure heat. Templar farms crossed heavy European horses with Arabian stock, creating a special Crusader horse. European nobles soon sent their own studs to be improved by Templar advice. In Iberia, Spain, and Portugal, where the order held frontier territories, Templar ranchers even developed cattle herding techniques so advanced they'd echo in the New World centuries later. The brothers went beyond raw production to add value. On many estates, they built water-powered mills, grist mills to grind grain, olive presses to extract oil, and fulling mills to finish wool cloth. They planted vineyards and ran wineries to turn Templar grapes into wine sold across Europe. Workshops on their lands made leather goods, tools, textiles, wine barrels, and other goods. By processing harvests into finished products, they gained more profit and reduced reliance on outside craftsmen. Managing all these activities required organization. The Templars developed standardized accounting methods applied across their holdings. Each estate kept records of crops, livestock, and labor. Every year, inventories and financial reports from local commanders were forwarded up to regional masters and ultimately to the Grand Master. This created unprecedented visibility over far-flung resources. Leaders could allocate funds or adjust strategies based on clear information, something almost impossible in most medieval economies. They also specialized by region. Recognizing each area's best product, they organized production accordingly. English estates, for example, focused heavily on sheep and wool. Southern estates in Spain, Italy, and the Holy Land emphasized olive oil and grapes for wine. Central European lands grew grain. Mountain territories supplied timber. All these goods flowed into the order's network, linking distant zones. For instance, wool from France might be woven into cloth paid for with olive oil from the Mediterranean estates, all under Templar coordination. Templar economic reach even extended into cities. The order built large complexes in major urban centers. In London, the New Temple had shops and houses around Fleet Street. In Paris, the Temple complex owned rental buildings on prominent streets. These urban properties generated cash income and gave the order a presence in key political and commercial hubs. Collecting rents and managing shops became part of their portfolio. Moving all these resources also demanded logistics. The Templars maintained their own transport convoys with pack mules and wagons. They established roadside way stations with inns and stables at regular intervals, providing secure lodging for Templar caravans. These wagons didn't just carry Templar goods, they also hauled freight for other merchants who paid the order for safe passage. In effect, the Templars ran an early protected freight service. Just as on land they had done at sea, they integrated production, processing, transport, and banking into a single system. Imagine a grain from an English farm. It might be milled at a Templar mill, loaded onto a wagon, transported to a port, shipped to the Holy Land, and sold there, all coordinated by the order's system. Money earned could then be banked in a Templar vault. This vertical integration minimized costs and kept profits within the organization. The scale of these operations meant the order needed many hands. Beyond the vowed brothers, who numbered in the thousands, the Templars employed a large workforce of tenants, laborers, and specialists. Tenant farmers lived on the estates. Craftsmen, blacksmiths, millers, winemakers, etc., worked in the workshops. Scribes and clerks kept the records. This created employment networks that radiated out through medieval society. Wages tended to be higher than typical, attracting skilled labor and encouraging loyalty. The order even took care to enforce safety and quality standards at its sites, uncommon practices for the time, again reflecting the blend of Christian ethics with administrative savvy. On the frontier, the Templars did far more than collect rents. In their Iberian lands, for example, they received grants of undeveloped territories. They invested in these wastelands by building infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, mills, and villages. In effect, They turned barren frontiers into productive regions through systematic development. Their successful model in Spain, with large estates turned into farms, would later be mirrored by European colonial powers in places like the Americas. In summary, by the 13th century, the Knights Templar had built a fully integrated economic empire. They farmed land, ran industries, transported goods, and managed finance as a single enterprise. This enterprise funded their military mission. It also transformed parts of Europe, applying advanced methods that predated similar innovations elsewhere. The Templars showed that even warrior monks could pioneer efficient business practices across an entire continent. Daily life in the order. Behind the grand strategy and the empire, daily life for a Templar brother was highly disciplined. From a distance, a group of Templars marching toward you would be strikingly uniform. Every full knight wore the famous white mantle over his armor, symbolizing purity. Underneath that, their clothes were simple: woolen tunics, linen undergarments, and leather boots made for durability, not style. They avoided any colorful or personalized emblems. Even their grooming was strictly regulated: haircuts short to fit under helmets, and beards neatly trimmed, never shaved off completely as was the secular fashion. These rules served practical military needs and spiritual symbolism, visually separating the brothers from worldly knights concerned with fashion. Their days followed a steady rhythm. The early bell called them to matins before dawn. After prayers and mass, they would eat a sparse breakfast together. Then, the morning was usually devoted to combat training and duties. Knights practiced formation riding, weapon drills, and archery. Horses were fed and stabled. Midday brought another prayer service, terce, and a larger communal meal. Mealtime was in silence, with a chaplain reading scripture aloud. The order's dining halls seated brothers by rank, the highest knights at the front of the long tables, sergeants below them. Unlike ordinary monasteries, the Templars ate meat on 3 days of the week, recognizing the extra strength needed for soldiers, but always in moderation. Afternoons varied by assignment. A brother at a frontier outpost might lead a patrol or escort merchants through a dangerous pass. At a regional commandery, he might oversee agricultural work, supervise craftsmen, teach new recruits in the training yard, or manage livestock. Others handled administrative tasks, inventorying supplies, corresponding with far-off preceptors, or training pages and sergeants. In short, each knight could find himself rotating through many roles in a career. One day, he might be drilling with lances, another day, writing letters or helping prune vineyards. At sunset, the brothers gathered once more for vespers, evening prayer, and a light supper. Then came Compline, the final prayer service. After Compline, silence was enforced until the next morning. Knights retired to simple dormitories, rows of rope beds or straw mattresses in a communal sleeping hall. Personal possessions were almost unheard of. Each brother's belongings were limited to what the order issued him: a couple sets of clothing, a belt, a few personal religious items, like a rosary, and his armor and sword. No one had furniture or private rooms. Even maps or books belonged to the order, not to individuals. Daily life could be even harsher depending on station. Knights at a frontier castle would sleep fully armed or in armor nearby, ready to respond to alarms. Those on ships had adapted routines for life at sea. Clerical brothers adjusted prayer schedules when on campaign or on ship decks. Despite these variations, the core pattern held everywhere: alternate prayer, work, and service from dawn till dusk in a disciplined cycle. This communal existence was built on a balance of hierarchy and equality. All brothers took the same vows and attended the same prayers, so there was a spiritual equality before God. Yet practical rank mattered. Commanders ate first, and knights and sergeants had different duties. Still, all members shared the same food and wore similar clothing: white cloaks for knights, brown or black for others, each with the red cross. The strict routine and brotherhood gave every member a sense of purpose in the order's mission, whether he wore a black habit, cooking meals, or a surcoat of mail charging in battle. Even routine chores were turned into opportunities for devotion. A sergeant washing a blade might do so in silence, meditating on its use for protection of the innocent. A knight could say a short prayer of gratitude when saddling his horse. In this way, the knights tried to ensure that even the most mundane tasks were performed with a spiritual awareness. In short, life in the Knights Templar combined the regimented discipline of a monastery with the duties of an elite military unit. From before dawn, prayers to fortified walls at night, every moment served their vow to God and their duty to protect Christendom. Templars in battle. The Knights Templar were at their heart a military order, and they fought in virtually every major engagement of the Crusader era. From the moment they began, their disciplined fighting made them invaluable in Crusader armies that were otherwise often poorly organized. Their battlefield reputation grew quickly as the Order's forces appeared on the front lines, alongside kings and nobility. One of the earliest notable battles was the Siege of Ascalon in 1153. Ascalon was a strategic coastal city that had long been a thorn in the side of the kingdom, as Egyptian armies often launched raids from there. Under Grand Master Bernard de Tremolay, the Templars played a crucial role. When a section of Ascalon's wall was breached during bombardment, Templar knights were among the first to charge into the opening. Bernard himself fought at the front. Though the city eventually fell to the Crusaders, the assault was costly. The Grand Master and about 40 brothers died in the fighting. Their sacrifice, however, helped secure a city that would be held by Christians for years to come. In contrast to such bloodshed, the Battle of Montgisard in 1197 stands as perhaps the greatest triumph in Templar memory. Saladin, the powerful Sultan of Egypt and Syria, invaded the Kingdom of Jerusalem with an army thought to number around 26,000 men. Opposing him was King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, a teenager still suffering from leprosy, with perhaps only a few hundred knights and a few thousand infantry. Among Baldwin's tiny force were about 80 Knights Templar, led by Grand Master Odo de Saint-Amand. Rather than wait, King Baldwin launched a surprise attack near the town of Montgisard. The disciplined charge of the Templar Knights shattered the unsuspecting Muslim forces. Panic spread through Saladin's army, and it was utterly defeated. Medieval chroniclers attributed this miraculous victory to divine favor and lauded the bravery of the Templars and the courage of Baldwin. The defeat was so thorough that retreating Saracens suffered huge losses, and Jerusalem's safety was secured for a time. The tide turned dramatically in 1187 at the Battle of Hattin. King Guy of Jerusalem, urged on by some advisors, led his army across waterless terrain in the scorching heat, a move many knights opposed. The army became exhausted and thirsty. The Muslim forces, led by Saladin, encircled the Christian camp. Templar and Hospitaller knights formed the rearguard to cover the army's retreat to the water sources, but they were overwhelmed. When battle finally erupted on July 4, 1187, the Templars fought desperately. Historical accounts tell of wave after wave of white-cloaked knights charging against Saladin's lines. Despite their valor, almost the entire force was killed or captured. That same week, Saladin personally oversaw the execution of around 200 captured Templars and Hospitallers, calling them the most dangerous warriors in the ranks. This massacre, and the capture of King Guy himself, paved the way for the fall of Jerusalem a few months later. After Hattin, the surviving Templars and Hospitallers became the primary defenders of the remaining Crusader cities. The military orders held firm in ports like Acre, Tyre, and Beirut, becoming the Christian footholds in the Holy Land. During the Third Crusade, 1189-1192, led by Richard the Lionheart of England and Philip II of France, the Templars once again played key roles. At the Siege of Acre, their navy kept a blockade that helped starve out the defenders. On land, their knights fought alongside the Crusader armies. If the main Crusader force was disorganized or leaderless, the Templars remained disciplined. By the end of that crusade, however, Jerusalem itself still lay in Muslim hands. Notably, The Templars held a strict policy on capture. Royal knights were often ransomed if taken prisoner, but the Knights Templar viewed captivity differently. They refused ransom offers whenever possible. They believed that accepting freedom while the Order's mission suffered would be dishonorable. This resolve meant that many Templars who fell were killed or enslaved rather than paid for. It also discouraged enemies from taking them alive. This ethos of fighting to the death, born of their vows, became part of their legendary image. Through victories and defeats alike, the Templars demonstrated courage, discipline, and often ingenious tactics. Whether storming a breach, forming the vanguard of a charge, or maintaining a blockade at sea, the White Mantle Knights left an indelible mark on Crusader warfare. Their reputation was so fearsome that even as Christian fortunes waned, the sight of a unit of Knights Templar still inspired confidence among allies and fear among foes. Decline of the Crusader states. By the 13th century, the situation in the Holy Land had deteriorated further. The Crusader states had been reduced to a narrow coastal strip that lacked the countryside needed to sustain them. Farms and villages beyond the coast were controlled by Muslims. This meant that even though the castles and cities held by Christians were formidable, they were permanently vulnerable. The fall of Acre in 1291 finally marked the end of the Crusader states. That catastrophe closed the final chapter on 2 centuries of Christian presence in the Holy Land and profoundly affected the Templars' mission and future. Several factors contributed to this decline. Even after the Third Crusade, enthusiasm for crusading in Europe faded. Popes repeatedly called for new expeditions, but European kings paid little attention. The Fourth Crusade was famously diverted to Constantinople, and later crusades drew only minor contingents. Only King Louis IX of France stood out by leading 2 costly crusades, 1248 and 1270, in an era when most rulers preferred to consolidate their own realms. In general, European monarchs became more preoccupied with politics at home than with distant crusades. This lack of aid meant the Templars and other defenders had to hold on with far fewer European reinforcements than before. Meanwhile, a new and more formidable foe emerged, the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. The Mamluks were slave soldiers who had seized power in Cairo by 1250. They formed a highly efficient army under leaders like Sultan Baybars, reigning 1260–1277. Unlike the earlier fragmented Muslim states, the Mamluks unified Egypt and Syria under a strong central command. They launched relentless campaigns to eliminate Crusader holdings one by one. Each siege and assault was carefully planned. By mid-century, they systematically reduced the castles and cities that once seemed impregnable, including the Templar strongholds of Saft and Beaufort. A disastrous foreshadowing came at La Fourbière in 1244, sometimes called the Second Battle of Hattin. Egyptian and Syrian forces crushed a combined Crusader army, including many Templar brothers. The Order's Grand Master, Pierre de Montaigu, disappeared in the fighting. This defeat, with hundreds of Templars lost, crippled the already thin defensive line. By the time Louis IX came to Syria in 1248, Jerusalem and all inland bases had been lost, and only a few coastal cities and castles remained. Meanwhile, Christian infighting made matters even worse. Rival Italian merchant factions frequently clashed in Crusader ports. In the 1250s, the Genoese and Venetians fought bitterly over Acre, the War of St. Sabas, to the point that Christian and Muslim walls in the city were literally painted with each side's enemy color. These civil wars drained manpower and diverted resources from the fight against the Mamluks. The 2 military orders, Templars and Hospitallers, even contributed to the disunity by focusing on competition as well as cooperation. Medieval chroniclers note that joint military plans often failed because each Grand Master was unwilling to place his troops under the other's command. The result was that the best soldiers available were not always used in the best way. Faced with near collapse, desperate Christian leaders took desperate measures. At times, they sought alliances with unlikely partners. Templar Knights even took part in diplomatic missions to the Mongol Empire, which was then expanding westward, and clashed with the Mamluks. The idea was to open a second front against common enemies. In 1300, for instance, King Edward I of England, who claimed to rule Jerusalem, teamed up with a Mongol army, but only captured a minor coastal town. It was too little too late. The Mongols eventually signed treaties with the Mamluks, leaving the Crusader states isolated. Castle Pilgrim, also known as Château Pèlerin, embodied the Templars' final stand. Built to guard the seaside approach to Acre, it was one of the strongest Crusader forts ever erected. Archaeological evidence shows that even as the end approached, the Templars continued strengthening its walls and towers against siege technology. Yet nothing could prevent the tidal wave of conquest. In 1291, Sultan Khalil, son of Qalawun, captured Tyre and Acre after fierce fighting. Thousands of Templars and civilians were evacuated by sea, but the coastal cities finally fell. This marked the collapse of Crusader power. The Order's main purpose, defending the Holy Land, had vanished in defeat. The downfall, conspiracy, and betrayal. With the Crusader states gone, the Knights Templar turned their attention to Europe, where they were as powerful as ever. But this wealth and autonomy soon aroused danger in Christian courts. King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, was deeply in debt to the Templars. He had made use of their financial services for years, even hiding in the Paris Temple during a riot in 1306. Yet, by 1307, Philip's attitude had changed from ally to predator. Guided by his cunning minister Guillaume de Nogaret, Philip planned a dramatic strike. On the morning of Friday, October 13, 1307, Paris awoke to a shocking sight. In a carefully coordinated operation, royal officials bearing sealed orders went door to door with armed soldiers. They arrested all Templar brothers and took control of their houses and strongholds across France. By nightfall, the most powerful military order in Christendom had been decapitated in a single, devastating stroke. Grandmaster Jacques de Molay himself was caught in Paris. Within hours, every Templar church in the kingdom held prisoners. Philip wanted not just their gold, but their legitimacy. He publicly accused the Templars of the most shocking crimes possible: heresy and grave impiety. Under torture, many knights confessed to such deeds. They supposedly had denied Christ during secret ceremonies, spat upon the cross, performed illicit kisses, and even worshipped a mysterious idol called Baphomet. The meaning of Baphomet remains unclear to this day, but in 1307 it sounded devilish enough. These charges were sensational and horrifying, designed to turn public opinion against the order. By framing the crackdown as religious purification, Philip hoped the church would not intervene to save an already accused group. Arrests soon spread beyond France. Hungary, England, Portugal, and other Templar-affiliated realms followed the French example, seizing Templar assets under pressure. In 1312, Pope Clement V, himself French-born and under Philip's influence, reluctantly dissolved the order. The remaining Templar leaders were held on trumped-up charges. Grandmaster Jacques de Molay, rearrested at last in 1314 after recanting under torture, was burned at the stake in Paris. On his deathbed, Molay allegedly proclaimed a curse that God would avenge his order. Remarkably, within the year both King Philip and Pope Clement died. Medieval observers claimed vindication in this coincidence. Thus, the once mighty Templars vanished not in battle, but through conspiracy. Their extensive properties were mostly seized. Philip grabbed the French lands, while elsewhere, sovereigns gave Templar houses to other orders. The hundreds of years of continuity were broken in a few tumultuous years of trial and execution. Yet, even as the order was extinguished, its story became a legend. Legacy of the Templars. Though the Knights Templar were officially no more after 1314, their influence lived on in surprising ways. In different countries, the surrender of Templar assets took different forms. England's King Edward II, under papal pressure, eventually transferred most former Templar estates to the Knights Hospitaller. In Iberia, the transition was more creative. In Portugal, King Dinis had already been sympathetic to the Templars. In 1319, he negotiated the creation of the Order of Christ. This new order adopted the same members, staff, and even much of the treasure of the Templars, essentially rebranding the order under church sanction. The Portuguese Order of Christ would later help sponsor voyages of discovery, with its cross emblem carried on the sails of explorers like Vasco da Gama. In Spain, former Templar resources went to military orders like Montesa and Santiago, which continued defending against the remaining Muslim states on the peninsula. In short, across Europe, the Templar property was absorbed into new or existing institutions, none following a single rule, but each reflecting local politics and needs. Architecturally, the Templars left a tangible legacy. Many of their castles, fortifications, and distinctive round churches still stand today. Churches built in their honor, modeled on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, survive in London, Temple Church, Paris, and other cities. Their once mighty fortresses, from the Levant to Wales and Scotland, dominate the landscape. Archaeologists continue to uncover Templar facilities, massive storehouses, docks, and engineering works. Each discovery connects us to how the order ran its complex operations. For example, recent digs at Acre, the old coastal capital, have revealed their shipyards and fortified piers, confirming medieval accounts of Templar naval prowess. Perhaps the most pervasive legacy is in finance. The banking practices pioneered by the Templars were picked up by later institutions. Italian merchants and bankers in the Renaissance saw the value of letters of credit, double-entry accounting, and bank vaults, innovations the Templars had already been using. The concept of a branch banking network that could transfer funds internationally was fully realized by the Templars' successors in Italian city-states. Many historians consider the Templars as laying groundwork for the modern banking system. Even techniques for managing estates and labor flow, such as corporate organization and wage systems, foreshadowed later economic models. The Templars' demise also set precedents, some grim. Their trial involved systematic torture and the use of forced confessions, foreshadowing methods later used in the Inquisition and witch hunts. The use of heresy charges to confiscate wealth became a tool often deployed in Europe. In that darker sense, the order's end taught a lesson about how religious authority could be manipulated by political power. Almost immediately after their suppression, the Templars became objects of legend. Tales grew of hidden treasure and secret survivors. One famous story says that Malay cursed Philip and Clement on the pyre. When both died within the year, it spread as an example of divine justice. In the British Isles, a legend attached Templar remnants to the Battle of Bannockburn, 1314. Supposedly knights fleeing France helped King Robert the Bruce of Scotland defeat Edward II. Though unsupported by contemporary records, such legends link the Templars to emerging national myths, Scotland, and later Freemasonry in England. In fact, in the 18th century, some Masonic rites even claimed symbolic descent from the Templars, weaving their imagery into modern fraternal orders. Today, the Knights Templar appear everywhere in culture. They star in novels like The Da Vinci Code, films like Indiana Jones, and video games like Assassin's Creed. Their white mantle with the red cross is an icon of medieval mystery. These stories often mix fact and fiction, but they underscore our fascination. The Templars have become symbols of chivalry, secrecy, and crusading spirit. Yet, beyond myth, their real story is compelling on its own. The dramatic arc, from humble pilgrimage guardians to international bankers and castle builders, then to sudden eradication, illustrates the heights and perils of the Middle Ages. The Knights Templar embodied the age's contradictions: piety and violence, wealth and poverty, loyalty and betrayal. Their history remains a powerful window into how medieval society organized its highest ideals and confronted its greatest challenges. Epilogue, farewell and conclusion. We have followed the Knights Templar from their founding in a holy land torn by war, through a century of conquest, enterprise, and spiritual devotion, to their tragic end amid political intrigue. What started as 9 brave knights guarding pilgrims became a vast organization that mastered armies, economies, and politics. Along the way, the Templars showed both the noblest and the harshest sides of medieval Christianity. They were monk warriors sworn to poverty and service, yet they wielded enormous power and wealth. Their rise and fall remind us that even the most extraordinary institutions are shaped by the hopes and fears of their time. Thank you for joining me on this long journey through history. I hope this story of the Knights Templar has given you insight into a world very different from ours, yet one that still echoes in our institutions and imagination. If you have learned something new, I'm glad our adventure together was fruitful. Farewell, and may we meet again on another voyage through the past. Safe travels on your own journeys of discovery.